for the invitation to speak here today. Just a brief disclaimer, all the translations I use, so as far as they're from the New Papyrus, they're, unless otherwise noticed, from the Editio Princeps, so I've used that. Fragments from Euripides and other texts are from the Loeb Classical Library, so this is for Euripides, Collard, and Kropp. I just didn't note it in every single case. So the new Euripides papyrus contains 60 lines from the Poluidos, of which 2 couplets, 2 sequences of 3 verses, and 1 sequences of 4 verses were previously known through the so-called indirect transmission, though not all as lines of this play, as we have seen in Patrick's contribution. Now, before the papyrus find, in turn, we had a tiny snippet of the hypothesis, so a plot summary, but really tiny on papyrus, a few testimonia to which I will return, and a baker's dozen of so-called fragments, so quotations in ancient writers. These quotations amounted to between 30 and 40 lines of this play. Now we have approximately 90 of it, so quite the advance. The play revolves around Poluidos' encounter with King Minos, whose dead son Glaukos he first locates thanks to his divinatory skills, and then is forced to revivify. So we've already heard some of this. Sorry for the slight repetition maybe of some material, but who knows, it might not hurt to hear it again. So the same story of this encounter between Poluidos and Minos seems to have been treated by the 2 other great tragedians who have not really been given much airtime so far, so in Aeschylus, in the so-called Cretan Women, and in Sophocles' Thais. So these are 2 other plays that dealt with this same subject matter. All of these fragments from the Poluidos plays, including also a comedy of that name, are masterfully edited by Laura Carrara, who's also a member of this group at the CHS, in her 2014 study L'Indovino Polido, so the seer Polidos. Now, we have a good sense of the rough plot of Euripides' play thanks to the accounts of the myth in Apollodorus, in the Bibliotheca, and in Hyginus, respectively. Now, both Patrick and Lindsay have done quite a lot to sort of tank this statement by saying, I mean, they're in the luxurious position that for the Aino, we actually do have a chapter in Hyginus called Euripides' Aino. So if that is already not just entirely to be taken for fact, then of course this here is much less clearly to be connected to the play. Nevertheless, what is there? I think we can still say we have somewhat the gist of what happened. Yeah? A bit more than the gist, perhaps. Now, I start with what Carrara treats as one of the testimonia for Euripides' play from the Platonic second letter. So this is addressed by Plato, or maybe I have to call him Plato. There's debates about the authenticity, as usual, to Dionysius the Younger, the ruler of Syracuse. Now, in this famous passage, Plato attempts to explain his own relationship to the ruler, to the tyrant he's addressing, as typical of the fraught relation between intellectual and political power. So he begins, by nature, practical wisdom and great power come together in the same place, and they always pursue and seek each other and come to be together. Moreover, these are qualities which people delight in discussing themselves in private conversation and hearing others discuss in their poems. He then goes on to list all kinds of such pairings or representatives of phronesis and dynamis megale, practical wisdom and great power. Now, we read on, and they are wont to sing the praises of Periander, the Corinthian, and Thales, the Milesian together, and of Pericles and Anaxagoras, again of Croesus and Solon as wise, and Cyrus as one in power, and so on and so forth. And the poets, imitating these things, bring together Creon and Tiresias, Polyidus and Minos, Agamemnon and Nestor and Odysseus and Palamedes. I think that's because Agamemnon is a bit of an idiot. He needs 3 advisors. So the first human being brought together Prometheus and Zeus in the same way. Now, obviously what matters for us is the moment he turns to the poets, and specifically the example of Polyidus and Minos. Now, Plato then turns to the very different types of relationship of wisdom and great power that it can take. Yeah? So of these, they sing of coming into conflict with each other, others into friendship. Now, I'm looking for a modern paradigm, you know. This is Emmanuel Macron, and of course, before he was powerful, and guess who? Paul Ricoeur. So he was a research assistant. So I tried to find an example. Anyway, this is one of philia, I think we can safely say, huge age gap. At any rate, he then continues to explain, so our Plato, that things can also turn from philia to diaphora. Yeah? They can go sour and come into conflict. Now, I mean, I guess it's on. I mean, yeah, I needn't say much more, I think. I mean, the big, beautiful papyrus has already set this up somehow. So anyway, this letter does not specify any sources, nor does it actually say, you know, where these examples come from. But it has been, as I say, connected as a testimonium for Euripides' Polyidus, which was on the evidence of its surviving fragments. So by that I mean anything we had before 22nd of November 1922. This was always remembered best for its staging of a tense confrontation between the seer and the tyrant. Now, in the letter, as I say, we don't know what exactly this relationship was, but it seems clear that this is, if ever, a relationship of philia, then one gone sour, certainly at the dramatic climax of the story. And it is all but certain that their conflict escalated over the question of whether or not Polyidus should revivify Minos' son Glaucus, who had previously gone missing. We've heard the story, and been located again by Polyidus' divinatory skills. Now, it's at this point that another theme must have come into sight that is strongly associated with Euripides' Polyidus in the indirect transmission. Minos' request that Glaucus be brought back to life gave rise to eschatological thought and speculation. A case in point are the play's most famous lines. Who knows if life is death, and if in the underworld death is considered life? Now, this couplet had an exceptionally rich afterlife. It's one of the most quoted bits of Euripides altogether. Not least in Plato's Gorgias, in a passage which itself teems with eschatological ideas. So I'll give you only the beginning here. Socrates says, well, but on your own view, life is strange. For I tell you, I should not wonder if Euripides' words were true. And then he sort of half remembers the quote, who knoweth if to live is to be dead, and so on. The passage is very well known for its equation of the soma, so the idea of the body as a sema, as a tomb. You will have encountered this before. Now, before the Gorgias, there was, of course, this. This is the parody of the lines in Aristophanes' Frogs, where Dionysus, the situation, has just declared that he will take Aeschylus back to the upper world, right, from the underworld, and Euripides yells at him, you bastard, you're going to stand by and watch me be dead? And then he gets this beautiful answer, so sort of, who knows if life be really death, a breath be dinner, and sleep a fleecy blanket. Now, these two themes associated with the play discussed so far, the conflict of dynamis megale and phronesis on the one hand, and eschatological thought and speculation, are prominently represented in the newly found lines of our papyrus. As has been variously argued and also mentioned today, it is most likely a set of excerpts. Yeah, there's a brilliant paper by Chiara Meccariello who tries to argue that the excerpt character is due to the fact that these are just one actor's lines, largely. So there's a bit at the beginning where that is not true, so it doesn't quite add up, but it's a highly attractive idea to think through. So many lines indeed seem most plausibly to be uttered by the seer, by Polyidus. In fact, to Minos, addressed to Minos. Now, if it's highly unlikely that we're dealing with any continuous passage of a play, there is nevertheless a certain unity of thought and vision in these lines. And it's quite interesting that Lindsay Koo has just told you pretty much the same thing, doubtless more eloquently, about the Eno play. Yeah? So this feeling of a certain unity or a thread running through, I think we can agree on that. It's not just a set of useful proverbs, that there is some kind of interaction between them, at least in part. Now, I think this precisely hinges on the co-presence of these two big themes. Now, in the following, here's a proposal for a reading which is based on the uncontroversial assumption that it forms part, or a lot of it forms part, of a discussion around Minos' demand that Polyidus revivify the dead son. Now, I'll focus on a few excerpts, and I'm sorry that I'll be partly a bit of a gallop through things. Yeah, we can't do everything in the detail it deserves, but we can maybe come back to it in question time. Then try to see, how does this fit into Euripides' work and possibly a wider intellectual context. That is really, I'm already full of admiration that in this weather anyone showed up. but then the punishment can only go so far. So I try to, you can also just say to me, enough. So if it's too detailed, or whatever, and a friend asked me whether we are trying to create the temperature of the find context, so probably less humid. Anyway, so this is from column 2. So when I say Polyidus in the following, or less often Minos, I always mean the person who is most likely the speaker of these lines. Yeah, but I will not say that every time. So just shorthand is just the name. But all of this is hypothetical, and to some degree, to more or less high degrees, a bit of speculation. Yeah? But always with plausibility on my side, or so I hope. Okay, so here Minos, so Polyidus, expresses his fear that if he does Minos a favor once, he will seek to obtain it again and again. Now, to understand this better, we need a bit of context. So both in Hyginus and in Apollodorus' accounts of this myth, the relationship between Polyidus and Minos is characterized by a series of favors that Polyidus has to render to Minos, one following from the other. So first, Polyidus is asked to find an apt analogy for a portent. That portent happens to be a 3-colored cow. The details vary in the different authors, but it's something about a color-changing cow or a calf. Now, he finds the analogy and says, well, it's like the mulberry or like the bramble, which goes from kind of greenish or whitish to reddish to black. Yeah, that's the analogy. Now, the finding of this analogy qualifies him as the seer who can now be sent out to go and find the child that's gone missing. And with a couple of bird signs, so there are more than one, for which we have testimony that occurred here, he actually finds, led eventually by a Glaucus, to the body of Glaucus, who has drowned in this vat of honey. Now, as soon as the boy is taken, found or taken out of the vat, I guess, Minos demands that he now revivify him. That's when you heard part of this story, when he gets shut in the tomb with the child, and then imitates a snake, yeah, who he previously kills, and who he then observes revivifying its fellow snake in this case. So he goes on to do the same thing. Now, Glaucus himself is then revivified. Now, Polyidus, sorry, I'm skipping ahead a bit. I mean, this is as good a moment as any to show that, yes, you've seen correctly, that this is, seem familiar, doesn't it? So here it is again, this beautiful white ground cup. I mean, Patrick has spoiled this for me and said everything already, but one thing he didn't say, and I think that's an interesting thought that I found in Axel Persson's 1942 Say the Lectures, or published in 42, where he says that this is actually very interesting. So in this cup, yeah, the artist has given us a tomb in section. Yeah? We see the figures literally placed inside of this tomb. Yeah? Also draws attention to the snakes here, and for the labels we already saw. I mean, they are labeled with their respective names. Now, the Persson, while I'm at it, incidentally also commented on the naivete of the representation here, and he said that Glaucus gives the impression of a cowering living being who watches the preparations for his own revival. So I thought that was very nicely put. Anyway, be this as it may, I return to my list, which I've just briefly interrupted, of Minos' demands placed on Polyidus. Yeah? In Hyginus, this is it. So once he brings back the child, he's handsomely rewarded and sent home. In Apollodorus, however, Minos says, thank you, now please teach him divination. Yeah? So Polyidus complies again, and then finally does depart, and upon departing undoes precisely this last act. I'm not sure how effective it was in the first place. I mean, if Glaucus had foresight, then why didn't he? No, anyway, it's fine. So here we are. Now, the editors of our papyrus, back to this passage, locate this at the very particular stage of this concatenation of events between Minos and Polyidus, and say this is precisely the reluctance, an expression of the reluctance to perform the resuscitation, yeah, or to bring this child back to life. Now, this makes a lot of sense, because although fear of detentions, could be located at almost any stage of Polyidus' interaction with Minos, this seems to be the act that he's most likely asked to repeat. Yeah? I mean, of course, first of all, the language of eudran dina and eubachein hypotinos is used elsewhere in Euripides, in this vague way for bringing someone back from the underworld, being brought back. So the scene in particular here is in Heracles, where previously there's more explicit Theseus' reference that he has this debt to Heracles since the day that when you brought me up from the dead into the light, or from the underworld into the light. Now, in that case, of course, the one eubaschon, the one who is getting the good deed, is the one who was actually dead. And here this is sort of transposed. But I still think it's a possible parallel in this sequence of the two expressions following each other. Now, more fundamentally, of all the tasks foisted upon Polyidus, revivification is really the one that Minos would most likely, as I say, ask to be repeated, possibly more than once. So, of course, he could be thought to be saying, find me another, no, I worry that if I find an analogy for you, you want more analogies. But there's no knowing that the need for such will ever occur. What is known that people will continue dying. And so that need might arise again. Now, elsewhere in Greek literature too, the act of revivification calls for repetition. So the best example for this is Asclepius, who, according to some sources, brought so many people back to life that Hades complained to Zeus about a shortage of death. Now, in other sources, he brought back just one specific individual. And in some of those sources, it is actually Glaukos, the son of Minos, he brought back. However, that seems to me to be an accretion, or a later accretion to Asclepios' dubious anti-Aristeia, facilitated, no doubt, by the important role, the healing role given to that snake, which was a famous symbol of Asclepius. Now, perhaps also that this being in the tomb of Polyidus and Glaukos could have been read by some as an incubation of sorts, so a healing method closely associated with Asclepius. Now, at any rate, in Euripides, whenever Asclepius appears, he is a serial reviver. It's not a one-off thing. So at the opening of the Alcestis, we hear Apollo tells us, well, Zeus killed Asclepius. And it's only in the Parados that we learn why. Actually, implicitly, they say, God, this is Alcestis must die, Only Phoebus' son, so Asclepius, if he still looked upon the light of the sun, would cause her to leave behind the gloomy realm and the portals of Hades. For he used to raise the dead, until the Zeus hurled goad of the lightning fire, killed him. So here you have it. He used to raise, imperfect tense, denoting frequency, and the plural, of course, of demathentas, of the beneficiaries of the action. So I dwell on the Alcestis here, not just to give you a grammar lesson, but as an example for one who repeats revivification, but also one who offends against these divine laws, against leading back from the dead, but also because it offers an overall instructive analogy or a parallel in some respects for our play. So to anticipate, the Polyidus, and certainly the lines preserved on the new papyrus, deals with the seer's reluctance to transgress against divine laws. But we know from external sources that the boy was revived in the end. So this kind of complete reversal of what was built up. And that is a parallel with the Alcestis. I mean, the entire tragedy, we cry about the sacrifice that this young woman has to do because everyone else is too selfish to die for her husband. And here you just saw the complaint of the chorus. So if only Asclepius were here, he could bring her back. But sadly, that's no longer possible. And then in the end, well, we have Heracles wrestling her out of the grip of Thanatos, of death, right? And returning her to her husband, which frankly, I think I'd rather be dead than married to that guy. But anyway, so I think it's very important to keep in mind this kind of reversal, that this potential parallel is something that we see more than once, and all this build-up of expectations that are then reversed. That is something very typical of Euripides. Now, note how Polyidus here is expressing fear. The same expression, dedoika, I fear, occurs again a few lines later. So apart from this, I fear that if I seek what must not be sought, I may suffer something unpleasant at the hands of the gods, and you too should fear this. Now at this point, however, Polyidus fears not Minos, but calamity sent from the gods. So read against the reluctance to comply with Minos' request for a good service, we have just seen that Polyidus' fear of divine retribution shows him caught between two forms of justice with their respective mechanisms of enforcement. Yeah? That of the tyrant on the one hand, and that of the gods on the other. Such a reconstruction of the clash between two diverging ideas of power stands in stark contrast with a view expressed earlier in the papyrus. This is presumably a line spoken by Minos himself, namely that tyrants, or in his perhaps more restrained phrasing, tyrannies are on earth what Zeus is in heaven. So a more literal translation brings out more clearly what the point is. In heaven, Zeus, on land, tyrannies have greatest sway. And so placed on Dynanta is a revealing synlepsis. It underscores the tyrant's implicit claim to similarity with Zeus. So in this reconstruction, Polyidus rejects such straightforward analogy between divine and mortal power, and instead he defines Minos' demand for revivification of the child as a transgression of divine law for which he himself would be liable. Yeah? So witness here, I would be a fool to transgress the laws of the gods. Or again, a few lines later, now seemingly redirected at Minos, you who are foolishly trying to overturn the established laws and throw the rules into confusion. Now, let us return to the passage we have already looked at. Yeah? So for Polyidus, complying with the will of the tyrant and seeking what must not be thought is tantamount to transgressing divine law and running the danger of divine punishment. Note the tone spoken here also. So this zeton da me zeteta is particularly striking. Now this is the lingo of an intellectual. So comparable to Tiresias in the Bacchae, for instance, when he goes on to translate Dionysus into a principle of the wet. It's this intellectualizing ring to it. Now, this intellectual tone of Polyidus' words is already manifest earlier in an earlier passage to which I now turn, and which for me constitutes the heart of this passage, or at least the nucleus of what interests me most about this. And that is the following. So, know well, whatever nature shoots up from the earth must live and die. For in time all things grow and change back. Each man becomes young and old in turn, yet living not twice, but just once. Now, as noted above, the interactions between Polyidus and Minos are defined by a concatenation of events, or demands, which leads to Polyidus' fearful expectation that successfully performing a revivification once will result in the compulsion to repeat it. Notably, however, the act of revivification itself entails a form of repetition. At stake is the question of whether or not the one life appointed to Glaukos can be extended or turned into two lives. You cannot live twice, but only once, is what Polyidus says. I cannot elaborate here on the force of the word for once, hapax, which looks as innocent as it sounds unpleasant and ominous, and occurs with conspicuous consistency in Homer as well as in tragedy, where eschatological statements are made. But at any rate, the idea of contested repetition, that defines the whole relationship between Minos and Polyidus, comes, I think, here. It is here that it comes to a head. Now, so the whole thing is some kind of crisis of iterability. And if you want to, I like to boil it down to the conflict between hapax once and palin, again and again. So there's a bit of a problem with this translation. So I'll argue presently, or if I have time, we'll have to see. Until when do I have?
You've actually got to 1:45.
To 1:45. Okay, 6 more minutes. Okay, I'm up for the challenge. Okay, so I, as I shall argue presently, I think that we're rather dealing with a changing again movement of this passage. Now, at any rate, this dialectic, say it again, between iterability, singularity, between change and fixity, runs through this section of the new Poluidos like a red thread, or at least the bits that I have pulled out. I mean, it's slightly disingenuous to claim it for the whole. Now, in this, it is here, you know, the boundaries of and an articulation of divine natural law. I think that is at the center of these very difficult lines. Now, the statement that whatever nature shoots up from the earth must live and die is explained, gar, and expanded on in the following sentence, where whatever nature shoots up from the earth is replaced with all things, da banta. So there's a kind of generalizing rephrasing. I mean, there's a bit of difficulties for me with logic in this passage. I find it very dark, actually, to understand. But crucially, the next line also introduces the dimension of time. So you have chrono. So bionai and thanein, everyone must do, in the timeless present of the nomic statement in the first two lines, is now reconceptualized as a process of growth and changing, changing again over time. So you have fuei corresponding to bionai and metistatai balin to thanein. Now, in a very sudden shift, the text then turns attention from the general statement about all things to the life of the human individual, specifying male human development hexes, so in sequential order from young man to old. Now, I'm happy to explain this later, but I've just made a very small alteration to the editio princeps, which I think makes something slightly more clear. And that is, I have inserted a comma, scandalous, between te and kai, allowing me to read this as kai in the sense of kai, but with a concessive participle. So that's why I translate yet living not twice but once. There was this problem in the editio princeps and the translation that they didn't properly deal with the kai. Luigi Battezzato has written about this, and this is the most conservative solution I see, to just assume a comma between these two particles. Now, at any rate, if the explanatory thrust of 27 to 28 suggests that metistatai balin corresponds to thanein, as a kind of euphemistic periphrasis or something, we are now prompted to reconsider the semantic value. And that's why I propose the translation changing again. So growing old is conceptualized as a process of changing again. Best analogous to, but certainly not identical with dying. After all, it is a process that is said to occur within one lifetime. So living once and not twice. Now, this statement about nature, life, and death raises the important question of personal identity over time, of how much change one man can undergo before he's no longer considered the same. But it is far from straightforward. So these are inherent difficulties, and the question is here, well, is something missing? Did something drop out? Can happen. We've seen it in Patrick's, Patrick showed us one of the examples. Is it the dark oracular language of the seer? The whole thing is also compounded by the awkwardness of the situation at hand. The addressee is a father unwilling to accept that his son died long before coming an old man. Why do you tell him, listen, there's a law, everyone is first a young man and then an old one? What is the tone? Is this supposed to be consolatory? it's not entirely easy to gauge. I mean, it's likely, I think. But I'm getting very close to 1/4 so I'm going to romp through at criminal speed just how this argument pursues. So one very important factor, I think, is the term physis. Yeah, that is something that according to a study of Franziska Egli about Euripides and intellectual trends reflected in Euripides, the term physis before the 420s always means the nature or character, is the nature of a particular thing, the character of a person, not nature as in, this thing we are all subject to. Yeah? So this is very much associated with the sophists around antiphon, and so here is precisely a moment where we have physis and things coming up from ge, yeah, from Gaia ge, from the ground. Now, so it is interesting to have this, and here I want to bring in a parallel from a Euripides fragment we don't know from which play, but which is a macarismos of a man who gains knowledge through inquiry, makes ethically sound choices, and he does so by observing nature's eternal and ageless order. So there, this observation of what nature asks you to do, and it's the divine rules of nature, the cosmos of nature, that is connected to ethically sound choice. And that is, I think, a close parallel, or it resonates with our passage. Now, well, and we have this idea of mathesis, precisely paired with that. And I mean, that reminds us again of this language of amathia that we saw earlier, of what doing the opposite would mean. And I'm not an idiot. I won't revivify this child. Well, if you probably wouldn't say it in such vulgar language. I'm not foolish. So anyway, last thing I'm going to say is the language metistatai palin. I mean, because so I think there is something interesting going on here. This junctura, or the expression metistatai palin, is Euripidean, so I've used a couple of times. But otherwise, we have in the 5th and 4th century, 2 attestations. So one is in Andokides on the changing fortunes of Athens, on return, and the other is here in Aristotle, in a treatise on colors, and this is specifically dealing with color changes in ripening processes in plants. And so here, this metistatai palin is used for the color change. Yeah, and here is one possible circle, and I will leave you really in the middle of things, but precisely, of course, to the mulberry analogy that we have at the play. Yeah, so there is some symbolism and cyclical logic that we should take into account. Thank you.